Three ordinary people, three completely different lives, and three experiences that still haunt them years later. One man returned home from overseas and slowly transformed into someone his own family no longer recognized. What started as a troubled personality spiraled into something so disturbing that relatives became genuinely afraid to be around him. Some believed it was mental illness. Others were convinced something much darker was involved. A teenage girl was enjoying a normal evening on her rooftop when she suddenly felt the unmistakable presence of someone sitting beside her in the darkness. Minutes later, she looked into a mirror and saw something that caused her to collapse from pure terror. And a young woman, exhausted after visiting her mother in the hospital, walked past a tree that locals had feared for generations. Soon afterward, strange claw marks began appearing throughout her home. Then one night, she looked outside and saw a figure hanging upside down in a way no human possibly could. Now, maybe there is a logical explanation for all of these stories. Maybe fear, stress, and coincidence created something that only seems supernatural. Or maybe these people encountered something that exists just beyond our understanding. Either way, what you are about to hear left permanent scars on everyone involved. And trust me, each story gets more disturbing than the last. The first story comes from a viewer named Bayezid, and honestly this one is unsettling because it doesn't start with ghosts, shadows, or things that go bump in the night. It starts with a real person, a man named Bahar Udin. According to Bayezid, Bahar had always been known as the difficult member of the family. You know how every family seems to have that one person who constantly creates drama wherever they go? That was Bahar. He had a short fuse, argued with almost everyone, and rarely took responsibility for anything. If relatives offered advice, he ignored it. If someone tried to help him, he pushed them away. Day after day, he would spend most of his time wandering around instead of helping at home, and eventually the constant tension started wearing everyone down. Years passed like that. The arguments became routine. The frustration kept building, and eventually his parents reached a point where they felt something had to change. That is when they made a major decision. They arranged for Bahar to move to South Korea, hoping that a fresh start in a new country might help him turn his life around. For the first time in years, the family felt hopeful. Maybe distance from old habits would force him to mature. Maybe a completely different environment would give him the opportunity to become a better version of himself. And for a while, it actually seemed to work. While living in South Korea, Bahar met a Korean woman. The relationship developed quickly, and before long, the two got married. Back home, his family couldn't believe the transformation. The same man who had spent years creating problems suddenly appeared to be building a stable life. Relatives started talking about how much he'd changed. Some even thought moving overseas had finally given him the discipline and responsibility he'd always lacked. Everything appeared to be heading in the right direction. But then, without any warning whatsoever, everything fell apart. Only a few months after getting married, Bahar abruptly left his wife behind and returned to his home country completely alone. No explanation, no clear reason. Family members were shocked. The marriage had barely begun, yet Bahar behaved as though it had never even happened. Whenever people asked questions, he avoided giving straight answers. The entire situation felt strange, but nobody could have imagined that this was only the beginning of something far more disturbing. Because shortly after returning home, Bahar became obsessed with marrying a young woman from a nearby family. And what happened next would completely change the course of his life. When Bahar returned home, his family expected him to settle back into normal life. Instead, they watched him become fixated on something else entirely. Not long after arriving, he developed a strong interest in a young woman who lived nearby. She was connected to a family in the neighborhood, and from the very beginning, the relationship created tension. The problem wasn't just that Bahar had recently abandoned a wife in another country. It was that almost everyone around him strongly opposed the idea. His parents reminded him that he was already married. Relatives pleaded with him to think carefully. Friends questioned why he was rushing into another relationship so quickly, but it didn't matter. The more people tried to stop him, the more determined he became. It was almost as if nothing anyone said could reach him. According to Bayezid, family members were shocked by how stubborn Bahar had become. Even people who had known him his entire life felt like they were talking to a completely different person. Eventually, despite all the objections, Bahar went ahead with the marriage, and that is when things started getting truly unsettling. You see, Bayezid's grandfather had always been suspicious of the young woman's family. For years, rumors had circulated throughout the community. Whispers passed between neighbors, stories exchanged behind closed doors. Some people claimed that certain members of the family practiced forms of black magic. Others dismissed those rumors as nothing more than small-town gossip. After all, every community has stories like that. Most people never take them seriously. At first, Bahar's family tried to ignore those rumors too. But after the wedding, they began noticing changes that were impossible to overlook. his temper became worse than anyone had ever seen. Arguments erupted over the smallest issues. Simple conversations turned into explosive confrontations. Family gatherings became incredibly stressful because nobody knew what might set him off. People who once felt comfortable around him started avoiding him altogether. The atmosphere changed whenever he entered a room. Everyone could feel it. Something wasn't right. And then, just when relatives thought his aggression was the biggest problem, Bahar started saying things that left the entire family genuinely frightened. Things so bizarre that nobody knew how to respond. And that is when the situation took a much darker turn. As Bahar's behavior became more aggressive, his family kept hoping it was just a phase. Maybe he was stressed. Maybe he was dealing with personal problems he wasn't talking about. Maybe, given enough time, things would settle down. But they didn't. In fact, they got much worse. The angry outbursts that had already been causing problems were soon overshadowed by something even more disturbing. Bahar began making strange claims. At first, relatives didn't take him seriously. When he said unusual things, people laughed them off. They assumed he was joking, exaggerating, or simply trying to get attention. But the more he talked, the more obvious it became that he genuinely believed what he was saying. And that is when concern started turning into fear. According to Bayezid, Bahar began telling people that he was a prophet. Not metaphorically, not as some kind of joke. He sincerely believed he had been chosen for a special purpose. He claimed he possessed knowledge that ordinary people couldn't understand. He insisted that others should listen to him because he had access to truths they didn't. The statements became more extreme with time. Conversations that once seemed merely strange suddenly became alarming. Family members didn't know how to react. Some tried reasoning with him. Others argued with him. A few simply stopped engaging altogether. Nothing seemed to make a difference. The more they challenged his claims, the more convinced he became. And perhaps the scariest part wasn't what he was saying. It was the way he said it. Bayezid explained that relatives often felt as though they were speaking to someone they no longer recognized. The familiar personality they had known for years seemed to be slipping away. The man standing in front of them looked like Bahar. He sounded like Bahar. But something felt different. Something felt off. As months passed, the situation became impossible to ignore. Family members started avoiding visits. Gatherings became smaller. People worried about what might happen if one of his outbursts escalated. Everyone agreed that whatever was happening, it was far beyond normal family problems. Desperate for answers, they finally decided to seek outside help. And the explanation they received would leave them more disturbed than ever. Because according to the person they consulted, Bahar wasn't simply changing. He was trapped. And something else might have been involved. By this point, Bahar's family felt completely lost. Nothing they had tried had helped. Reasoning with him didn't work. Arguing with him didn't work. Giving him space didn't work. Every week seemed to bring a new incident, a new bizarre claim, or another explosive confrontation. The man they once knew was slipping further and further away. Eventually, desperation pushed the family to seek help from someone outside their immediate circle. They contacted a local spiritual healer and explained everything that had happened: the troubled past, the sudden return from South Korea, the controversial second marriage, the dramatic personality changes, the aggressive behavior, and the increasingly disturbing claims that Bahar was some kind of prophet. The healer listened carefully. According to Bayezid, he didn't seem surprised by what he was hearing. In fact, after hearing the full story, he reportedly offered an explanation that immediately sent chills through the room. The healer claimed that Bahar's wife had used supernatural means to gain influence over him. More specifically, he suggested that a powerful spiritual entity had become involved, and that Bahar was no longer entirely in control of himself. For some family members, that explanation sounded unbelievable. For others, it seemed to fit the rumors they had heard for years about the woman's family. And that is what made the situation even more frightening. Nobody knew what to believe. Was Bahar suffering from a serious mental illness that nobody understood? Had years of personal struggles finally caught up with him? Was he being manipulated by people around him? Or was there actually something supernatural happening behind the scenes? The family argued endlessly about those questions. But regardless of what explanation they accepted, everyone agreed on one thing. Something had gone terribly wrong. As the years passed, Bahar never fully returned to the person he used to be. His strange behavior continued. His connection with reality seemed increasingly fragile. And the hopes his family once had for his future slowly disappeared. Today, he lives a largely isolated life. Relatives still speak about him with sadness and confusion. Because even after all this time, nobody has been able to provide a definitive answer for what happened. And honestly, that is what makes this story so unsettling. Sometimes the scariest mysteries aren't the ones we can explain. They're the ones that leave us with questions that never get answered. But as disturbing as Bahar's story is, the next story might be even more terrifying. Because it begins with a teenage girl enjoying a perfectly normal evening on a rooftop, until she realized she might not be alone. The next story was sent in by a middle school student named Muna, and unlike the first story, this one didn't unfold over years. It happened in a single night. A night she says she will never forget. Back in 2022, Muna and her family moved into a new house. At first, she absolutely loved it. The neighborhood was peaceful, the area felt safe, and the property had something that made it stand out from every other house nearby. A massive banyan tree. The tree towered over part of the property, its huge branches stretching outward like giant arms. During the daytime, it looked beautiful. But at night, those same branches created deep shadows that seemed to swallow the surrounding area. Most people in the neighborhood simply admired it. And so did Muna. She wasn't afraid of the tree at all. In fact, one of her favorite things to do was spend time on the rooftop in the evenings. She would take her guitar upstairs, sit beneath the open sky, and practice while enjoying the cool night air. It became part of her routine, something she looked forward to every day. Then one evening, after finishing dinner, she headed upstairs like she always did. At first, everything seemed completely normal. The neighborhood was unusually quiet. No children playing outside, no nearby conversations, almost no wind. The giant banyan tree stood perfectly still against the dark sky. Muna sat down, adjusted her guitar, and started playing. For several minutes, nothing felt unusual. Then suddenly something changed. She couldn't explain exactly why. There was no sound, no movement, no warning, yet out of nowhere, a powerful feeling washed over her. The unmistakable sensation that someone was sitting right beside her, not standing across the rooftop, not watching from a distance, sitting directly next to her. Close enough to touch. Her fingers immediately stopped moving across the strings. A chill ran through her body. Every instinct she had suddenly screamed that she was no longer alone. The silence around her felt different now, heavier, almost suffocating. She stared forward, trying to convince herself she was imagining things. But the feeling refused to go away. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger. Slowly, she turned her head toward the empty space beside her. Nothing. Nobody was there. The rooftop appeared completely empty. Yet somehow, that didn't make her feel any better, because despite seeing nothing, she still felt a presence. As if something invisible was sitting inches away from her, silently watching, and that is when pure fear took over. Muna grabbed her guitar, stood up, and rushed downstairs as fast as she could. She kept telling herself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe she was tired. Maybe her imagination was running wild. Maybe it was just one of those strange feelings people sometimes get. But only a short time later, something happened that completely destroyed every rational explanation she had. And what she saw next would cause her to collapse on the floor. After rushing downstairs, Muna tried her best to calm herself down. Her heart was still racing from whatever she had felt on the rooftop, but she kept repeating the same thing in her head. You are overreacting. There is nobody there. It is all in your imagination. We've all done that before, right? Something feels wrong, but we convince ourselves there is a perfectly normal explanation. For a little while, that seemed to help. The familiar surroundings of the house made her feel safer. Family members were nearby. The rooftop was behind her. Whatever strange feeling she had experienced seemed far away now. Or at least that is what she thought. A short time later, Muna went into the bathroom. It was an ordinary moment. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have been frightening. She stood in front of the mirror looking at her reflection. Then she glanced upward and instantly froze. Every muscle in her body locked up. According to Muna, reflected behind her was something that absolutely should not have been there. A figure. A horrifying figure. She described it as having glowing red eyes and a twisted appearance that looked completely inhuman. For one horrifying moment, she was staring directly at it, and it was staring back. Imagine looking into a mirror and seeing something standing behind you when you know for a fact nobody else is in the room. That is exactly what made the experience so terrifying. Muna couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't look away. The shock hit her all at once. Then everything went black. She collapsed. When she regained consciousness, she found her family gathered around her. Everyone was asking questions. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. But Muna was barely able to speak. She was shaking, crying, completely terrified. The image of those glowing eyes remained burned into her memory. Even after waking up, she couldn't stop thinking about them. And unfortunately, the nightmare wasn't over. Because in the days that followed, strange events reportedly continued around the house. Events that made the family start wondering whether Muna had really seen something that night. And the explanation they would eventually receive was even more disturbing than the encounter itself. After the incident in the bathroom, life inside Muna's home changed completely. The house that had once felt comfortable and welcoming suddenly felt different. Every room seemed unsettling. Every strange noise grabbed their attention, and every shadow made people nervous. At first, Muna's family tried to find a reasonable explanation for what had happened. Seeing a frightening image after already being scared on the rooftop could have been caused by stress, exhaustion, or panic. But according to Muna, the strange experiences didn't end with the figure in the mirror. Over the following days, unusual incidents reportedly continued around the house. Small things at first, moments that were easy to dismiss individually. But when they started piling up, they became much harder to ignore. The family noticed that Muna seemed constantly uneasy. She no longer wanted to spend time alone. The rooftop, which had once been her favorite place in the entire house, became somewhere she refused to visit after dark. Even walking through certain parts of the home made her uncomfortable. What frightened her most wasn't any specific event. It was the feeling. The same feeling she had experienced that night on the rooftop. The sensation that something was nearby. Watching, waiting. As the weeks passed, concern spread throughout the household. Family members began discussing what they should do. Some believed there had to be a logical explanation. Others weren't so sure. Eventually, they decided to seek spiritual help. They explained everything that had happened, the strange feeling on the rooftop, the terrifying figure in the mirror, Muna's collapse, and the continuing sense that something wasn't right inside the home. The response they received was deeply unsettling. According to the people they consulted, a supernatural entity had become attached to Muna. They were told that whatever she encountered was attempting to draw her closer to its world. Whether that explanation was accurate or not, hearing it only increased the fear inside the house. Now the family wasn't just worried about what had happened, they were worried about what might happen next. Determined to protect her, they sought additional guidance from a respected religious scholar. After listening to the story, he provided Muna with a protective amulet and advised the family on steps they could take moving forward. For the first time in weeks, they felt a small sense of hope, but the decision they made afterward would ultimately change everything. Because rather than risk staying any longer, the family chose to leave the house behind completely. And once they did, something remarkable happened. The strange occurrences stopped, almost immediately. But even though the family escaped whatever had been happening there, Muna never forgot the thing she saw staring at her from that mirror. And to this day, she refuses to return to that property. But hold up, because the final story of the night might be the most chilling one yet. It starts with a young woman walking home from the hospital after dark. A simple walk, a normal evening, until she passed beneath a tree that locals had feared for years. The final story was sent in by Adiba on behalf of her friend Titu, and unlike the previous stories, this one began during one of the most stressful periods of Titu's life. At the time, her mother was recovering from surgery. As you can imagine, the entire family was under enormous pressure. Hospital visits became part of daily life. Days blended together, sleep was hard to come by. Every update from doctors carried emotional weight. For Titu, the routine was exhausting. She spent countless hours traveling back and forth to the hospital, trying to support her mother while balancing everything else happening around her. Then one evening, after another long visit, she began the journey home alone. It was already dark outside. Most of the streets were quiet. The usual daytime activity had disappeared. Titu was tired, emotionally drained, and focused on one thing: getting home and finally getting some rest. As she walked, she approached a large tamarind tree standing beside the road. The tree had been there for years. Locals knew it well, and according to neighborhood stories, many people deliberately avoided passing near it after sunset. Some claimed strange things had happened around it. Others said they felt uncomfortable whenever they got too close. Most people treated those stories like old local legends, and honestly, Titu did too. She wasn't thinking about ghost stories. She wasn't looking for anything unusual. She simply continued walking. Then, as she passed beneath the tree, something happened. A sudden feeling washed over her, powerful. Instant. Impossible to ignore. Without warning, she felt as though someone or something was watching her. Not from a nearby window, not from a nearby window, not from another part of the street. From somewhere much closer, the sensation was so intense that she immediately looked around. The road appeared empty. No pedestrians, no strangers, no obvious source for the feeling, yet the uncomfortable sensation refused to disappear. Every step she took afterward felt heavier. Her instincts kept telling her that she wasn't alone, that unseen eyes were following her movements. By the time she reached home, she couldn't shake the feeling. Something about that walk felt wrong, deeply wrong. She tried to push the thought aside and focus on relaxing. But later that night, she noticed something inside her room that stopped her cold. Something that had definitely not been there before. Large scratch marks, deep scratch marks. And what happened next would convince her that the strange feeling beneath that tree was only the beginning. After arriving home, T2 tried to convince herself that the strange feeling near the tamarind tree was nothing more than stress. Considering everything she was dealing with, that explanation made sense. Her mother was recovering from surgery. She was exhausted from constant hospital visits. And when people are tired, their minds can sometimes play tricks on them. At least, that is what she told herself. For a while, she managed to push the experience into the back of her mind. Then she walked into her room and immediately noticed something was wrong. At first, she wasn't sure what she was looking at. But as she got closer, her stomach dropped. There were large scratches carved into the wall. Not small marks. Not random scuffs. Deep scratches. The kind that looked as though something with enormous claws had dragged itself across the surface. T2 stood there staring, confused, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She knew those marks hadn't been there before. Someone would have noticed them. They were impossible to miss. Naturally, her first thought was that somebody had played a prank, maybe a family member. Maybe someone had accidentally damaged the wall. But the more she looked, the less that explanation made sense. The scratches appeared strange, uneven, and unusually deep. They didn't resemble ordinary damage, and things became even more unsettling when additional marks began appearing elsewhere in the house. According to the story, similar scratches later showed up on other surfaces, including the refrigerator. Now the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The entire family noticed them. Everyone had questions. Nobody had answers. T2's anxiety began growing day by day. Every new mark felt like evidence that something wasn't right. The strange feeling she'd experienced near the tree suddenly seemed far more important. What if it wasn't just stress? What if something had actually followed her home? The thought terrified her. Still, as frightening as the scratches were, they weren't the worst part. Not even close. Because one night, while standing near the balcony, T2 looked outside and saw something that shattered every attempt at finding a normal explanation. Something that shouldn't have been possible. Something she says she will never forget for the rest of her life. And for several horrifying seconds, it stared right back at her. By this point, T2 was already on edge. The mysterious scratches appearing throughout the house had left her deeply unsettled. Every day seemed to bring more questions and fewer answers. Even when she tried to focus on helping her mother recover, the strange events kept creeping back into her thoughts. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late. The house was quiet. Most people had settled in for the evening, and the neighborhood outside was nearly silent. T2 was standing near the balcony when she casually glanced outside. She wasn't expecting to see anything unusual. She certainly wasn't prepared for what happened next. At first, her eyes struggled to process what they were looking at. The shape seemed wrong. Completely wrong. For a moment, she thought she must be mistaken. But the longer she stared, the more horrifying the reality became. According to T2, there was a figure outside. Not standing, not walking, not sitting. Hanging upside down. The position of its body appeared unnatural, almost impossible. It reminded her of a spider clinging to a surface, except this wasn't a spider. It looked human-shaped, or at least something close to human. Every instinct in her body screamed that what she was seeing should not exist. She froze. Unable to move, unable to look away. The figure remained there for several terrifying seconds. And during those moments, T2 felt the same overwhelming sensation she had experienced beneath the tamarind tree. The feeling of being watched, studied, observed. As though whatever she was looking at had been aware of her long before she noticed it. Fear surged through her entire body. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But shock held her in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, gone. No sound. No movement. Nothing. One moment it was there. The next moment it wasn't. T2 stood frozen, staring into the darkness, trying to understand what had just happened. But there was no explanation. No logical answer. Only fear. And unfortunately, the encounter marked the beginning of an even more intense period of strange activity. The family became increasingly concerned and eventually realized they couldn't handle the situation alone. Desperate for answers, they decided to seek religious guidance. And the explanation they received would forever change the way T2 viewed that night beneath the tamarind tree. After seeing the upside-down figure, T2 knew she couldn't simply ignore what was happening anymore. The scratches, the overwhelming feeling near the tamarind tree, the constant sense that something was watching her, and now the impossible figure she had seen outside. Taken individually, maybe each event could be explained away. Together, they painted a much more disturbing picture. As the strange experiences continued, fear spread throughout the household. Family members became increasingly worried, not only about what had happened, but about what might happen next. Eventually, they decided to seek help from a religious advisor. They explained everything in detail. The late-night walk home, the uneasy feeling beneath the tree, the unexplained scratches appearing around the house, and the horrifying sight of the upside-down figure. The advisor listened carefully before offering an explanation. According to him, something had become interested in Titu during one of her nighttime walks. Specifically, he believed the encounter near the tamarind tree marked the beginning of the entire ordeal. Whether his explanation was supernatural or symbolic, it gave the family a path forward. He recommended a specific 41-day spiritual practice and advised Titu to follow it exactly as instructed. Wanting the nightmare to end, she committed herself fully to the process. Day after day, she followed the guidance. Week after week, she stayed consistent. And gradually, something began to change. The strange activity started fading. The fear that had dominated her daily life slowly loosened its grip. The unsettling feelings became less frequent. No new frightening encounters occurred, and eventually the experiences stopped altogether. For the first time in months, Titu felt like she could breathe again. Today, she is living a normal life and has never experienced anything similar since. But there is one thing that hasn't changed. She still refuses to walk near that tamarind tree after dark. Because no matter how much time passes, she can never forget what happened after she walked beneath its branches that night. And honestly, after everything she witnessed, it is hard to blame her. Those were the 3 stories for tonight. 3 ordinary people, 3 completely different experiences, and 3 mysteries that remain unresolved to this day. Maybe Bahar's transformation was the result of psychological struggles that nobody fully understood. Maybe Muna's terrifying encounter was born from fear, stress, and the power of the human mind. Maybe Titu's experiences had explanations hidden somewhere beneath the surface. Or maybe there are still things in this world that we simply don't understand. That is what makes stories like these so unsettling. They don't happen to paranormal investigators or people actively searching for the supernatural. They happen to ordinary people living ordinary lives. People who never expected anything unusual to happen to them. And then one day, everything changes. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, make sure to leave a like and let me know in the comments which story disturbed you the most. And if you've ever experienced something strange, unexplained, or genuinely terrifying, feel free to share your story as well. Who knows, it might appear in a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware of your surroundings, and if you are ever alone in the dark and suddenly feel like someone is standing beside you, you might not want to look, because sometimes the things we can't see are far more frightening than the things we can. And you never know what might be looking back.